March 15, 1944. Inside the Japanese Naval Intelligence Headquarters at the Oda Communications Unit, Commander Atsuzo Kurihara sat at his desk, staring at an intercepted transmission. His third cup of bitter tea had gone cold. For the last 18 hours, he and his team, Japan's top cryptanalysts, had been trying to decode what seemed to be U.S. Marine Corps tactical communications linked to the Marshall Islands campaign. The signals they were picking up weren't random. Kurihara noticed patterns that matched Marine Corps procedures: timing before attacks, lengths consistent with orders, and frequencies the Marines were known to use. Yet the language itself was impenetrable. Nothing in their files, which covered years of Allied communication systems, matched what they were hearing. Kurihara's unit was one of the most advanced signals intelligence operations in the world. The Oda facility, about 20 miles from Tokyo, had 500 personnel, 118 radio receivers, and 20 direction finders. His team had already broken American diplomatic traffic, cracked British naval messages, and unlocked multiple Allied Army codes. Before Pearl Harbor, they had even penetrated the U.S. State Department's Purple Code, which gave Japan critical insights in the early years of the war. But these Marine messages were different. They were impossible to solve. By year 3 of the war, Japan's brightest minds had successfully broken dozens of Allied systems, but here they faced complete failure. What Kurihara couldn't know, what no Japanese officer realized until after the war, was that they were listening to the only military code in modern history that would remain unbroken: the Navajo Code. This story, however, doesn't begin in the Pacific. It starts in the American Southwest, where for centuries the Navajo people had preserved a language found nowhere else on Earth. Known as Diné Bizad, Navajo belongs to the Athabascan language family. In 1940, about 170,000 speakers lived almost entirely within a 27,000 square mile reservation stretching across Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. Its linguistic structure, developed over thousands of years, created a natural barrier against outside understanding. Navajo is built around verbs, with meanings shaped by complex combinations of prefixes, so many possibilities that they number in the millions. The language also uses 4 tones, high, low, rising, and falling, that completely change word meanings. Even a slight mispronunciation can turn an entire sentence incomprehensible. Its phonology contains sounds unknown in Japanese, English or most languages, explosive ejective stops, a voiceless lateral fricative that sounds like air through teeth, glottalized sonorants, and nasalized vowels. For Japanese linguists trained in a system of just 5 vowels, accurately hearing these sounds was nearly impossible. The man who saw the military potential in this was Philip Johnston. Born in 1892 to a missionary living on the Navajo reservation, Johnston grew up fluent in the language, one of fewer than 30 non-Navajos who could claim that ability. By age 9, he was translating his father's sermons. At 15, he traveled to Washington to interpret for Navajo leaders during a meeting with President Theodore Roosevelt. In December 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Johnston read about U.S. Army training exercises where Comanche speakers were used for communication. He also knew that Choctaw speakers had helped in World War I, but those earlier efforts were improvised and small scale. Johnston imagined something far more ambitious: a formal military code built entirely on Navajo. It would be unbreakable, fast, and practical for modern combat. On February 28, 1942, Johnston met with Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott near San Diego to demonstrate his idea. 4 Navajo speakers transmitted messages while Marine officers compared their speed against standard equipment. The result was astonishing. The Navajo system sent a message in 20 seconds while the M209 cipher machine needed 30 minutes for the same task. General Vogel immediately approved a trial. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits were sworn in at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. Among them were Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, Lloyd Oliver, and John Benally. Some had attended boarding schools where speaking Navajo was forbidden and punished. Others were traditional herders who had rarely left their homeland. At Camp Elliott, in a locked and guarded building, they spent 8 weeks creating a new code within their own language. The task was enormous. They had to invent terms for modern military equipment that didn't exist in Navajo, create a usable alphabet system, and ensure the code was easy to memorize but impossible for outsiders to break. Their approach used cultural logic. A submarine was described as beshlo or ironfish. A battleship became lotso or whale. Fighter planes were dahitihi or hummingbirds. Bombers were jaysho or buzzards. For the alphabet, each letter had multiple Navajo words so that frequency analysis would be useless. For example, the letter E had 4 alternatives: elk, eye, ear, and edible fruit. Code talkers switched randomly between them to prevent patterns. The first version of the code included 201 terms, all memorized by the recruits. No written code books were allowed. Capture could mean disaster. As Chester Nez later recalled, we drilled endlessly. A single mistake could cost lives. In our culture, words hold power, and speaking correctly is sacred. The code's first combat test came at Guadalcanal in August 1942, where the Marines discovered just how powerful and reliable the Navajo Code Talkers would become. 15 Navajo Code Talkers landed with the 1st Marine Division. The Japanese had been expecting the invasion, since they had already cracked other Allied codes. But suddenly, Marine battlefield communications became impossible for them to read. At the Japanese 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul, intelligence officers scrambled to make sense of these new messages. Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, who had studied at Stanford before the war, reported, "The transmissions are structured like a language. The patterns are consistent, but they don't match English, French, Dutch, Spanish, any Philippine dialect, or any Chinese dialect. It is completely alien." Japan responded quickly. Top cryptanalysts were assigned. Hundreds of hours of transmissions were recorded on wax cylinders. Every technique in their arsenal was tried. They even brought in university linguists and Buddhist monks trained in ancient languages. Nothing worked. On November 8, 1942, Code Talker Chester Nez sent artillery coordinates for a Japanese machine gun nest. His transmission lasted just 14 seconds. It was intercepted by Japanese operators, but to them it was meaningless noise. Minutes later, American shells hit the target with deadly precision. Colonel Haru Kanuma, intelligence officer of the Japanese 17th Army, admitted in frustration, "The Americans are using a code that defeats every attempt. We can no longer anticipate their attacks. We are fighting blind." Japan's best hope came from Joe Kiyumiya, a Navajo soldier captured at Bataan in April 1942. He was fluent in Navajo, but he had no knowledge of the secret code being developed for the Marines. When Japanese cryptographers began intercepting Navajo transmissions, they brought Kiyumiya to the interrogation center at Aona. He listened to recordings of code talkers. He recognized Navajo words but strung together in ways that made no sense. The turtle is attacking the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs. When he couldn't translate, interrogators accused him of lying. Torture escalated. He was waterboarded, beaten, and hung by his arms for hours. In the winter of 1943, guards forced him to stand naked in the snow until his feet froze to the ground. He was starved down to 90 pounds. Food offered only if he could produce translations. Through it all, Kiyumiya told the truth. He understood the words, but not their military meaning. A Japanese intelligence report from May 1943 summed up their frustration. The prisoner appears native to the mystery language but cannot comprehend the messages. Either he shows extraordinary resistance or the enemy uses a specialized code within the language requiring special training. The second guess was right. Even fluent Navajo speakers could not understand the code talker system without training. Kiyumiya endured 312 years in captivity. His inability to help convince Japanese intelligence they were facing something completely new. By late 1943, most efforts to break Navajo transmissions were abandoned. Meanwhile, U.S. commanders saw immediate value. Success at Guadalcanal led to rapid expansion of the program. Major General Alexander Vandegrift wrote, "The Navajo communicators have proven invaluable. Their messages are faster than any machine and absolutely secure." A formal code talker school opened at Camp Pendleton, processing new classes every 8 weeks. By war's end, between 375 and 420 Navajo Marines had served as code talkers across all 6 Marine divisions. Training was unlike anything else in the Marine Corps. Recruits worked in soundproof booths while recordings of battlefield noise played in the background. They practiced transmitting messages while wearing gas masks, running, or carrying heavy loads. Thomas Bigay, who enlisted at just 15, remembered, "They pushed us beyond what, for outsiders, they were impossible to decode." By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence threw more resources at the problem. The Imperial Navy's 4th Section assigned 30 cryptanalysts exclusively to Navajo transmissions. Captain Yoshiro Tanaka tried new approaches: musical analysis for tonal patterns, comparisons to Native American recordings, even consultations with U.S.-trained scholars. They built special devices to slow down transmissions without changing pitch. They charted sound frequencies using oscilloscopes. They studied message lengths, identifying probable call signs and correlations between transmission length and operation size. But without understanding the words, these findings were useless. Japanese units were ordered to capture code talkers alive. Rewards of 10,000 yen, 10 years' salary, were offered for code talker equipment or documents. Several close calls happened, but no code talker was ever taken with their gear intact. The Central Pacific Campaign further proved their importance. At Tarawa in November 1943, 6 code talkers kept communications going through 76 hours of brutal fighting. Lloyd Oliver worked non-stop for 48 hours, directing naval gunfire while shells exploded around him. During the Marianas Campaign, 24 code talkers operated at Saipan around the clock. Japanese Lieutenant Commander Takashi Horiwaka had cracked conventional communications and predicted the invasion. But once Marines landed, all tactical intelligence vanished. The Navajo Code left Japan blind on the battlefield. Colonel Takashi Saito later observed, "Commanders felt helpless without the intelligence they once relied on." At Peleliu, code talker Jimmy King worked for 6 straight hours during a Japanese counterattack after his partner was killed. Under constant fire, he coordinated artillery from 3 battalions, sending 40 flawless messages that turned the tide of the fight. But the most famous contribution came at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, relied entirely on the Navajo Code during the invasion's opening phase. 6 code talkers working in pairs maintained non-stop communication through the most critical 48 hours of the operation. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 2 years building an underground fortress of 11 miles of tunnels. His defense plan depended on intercepting U.S. communications to time counterattacks, but the plan collapsed immediately. Over the first 2 days, the 6 code talkers transmitted and received more than 800 messages without a single mistake. They coordinated the landing of 30,000 Marines, directed fire from 100 naval ships, organized close air support, marked enemy positions, arranged medical evacuations, and managed supplies, all while under heavy fire. Major Connor later testified, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. During the first 48 hours, I had 6 Navajo radio nets running continuously. They handled over 800 messages without an error. The entire operation was directed by Navajo Code." Meanwhile, Colonel Shigeto Hayashi reported to Kuribayashi that American codes were still unbreakable. He noted the speed difference. Artillery requests that took 20 seconds in Navajo would have required 30 minutes with conventional systems. The gap meant the difference between wiping out enemy positions or losing them. At Okinawa, the code talkers again proved vital. 35 Navajo Marines coordinated the largest Pacific assault of the war, 183,000 troops across 82 days of battle. Japanese forces tried jamming signals and even attempted voice mimicry, but the tonal complexity of Navajo made it impossible. According to code talker Alfred Newman, Lieutenant Hiroshi Miyamoto's attempts to mimic Navajo sounded like someone gargling while trying to talk. On August 14, 1945, code talker Teddy Draper sent one of the most historic messages of the war, "Nihima adigi nihadli," Japanese surrender. Appropriately, the announcement first traveled through the Navajo Code before being transmitted by conventional channels. After the war, interrogations of Japanese officers revealed just how thoroughly they had failed. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japan's chief of intelligence, admitted, "We never broke the Marine Code. We cracked Army codes, Air Force codes, even diplomatic traffic, but the Marine Tactical Code was completely secure." Captain Yasuji Kawamoto was equally clear. "We recorded thousands of transmissions. Our best linguists studied them for 3 years. Nothing worked. It was our greatest cryptanalytic failure." By 1944, some analysts had guessed the code might be based on Native American languages and even requested German help. But wartime problems and German ignorance of indigenous languages made progress impossible. Colonel Masao Yamada admitted, "Not being able to read Marine communications cost thousands of lives. Every Marine operation after 1942 was a mystery until it began. Major Hiroshi Tanaka, who survived Iwo Jima, described the psychological toll. We couldn't understand their words. It made us feel primitive, defeated before the battle even started. Yet victory did not bring recognition for the Code Talkers. Their program stayed classified for potential Cold War use. They returned home unable to tell anyone about their service. Many went back to states that still denied them voting rights, until 1948 in New Mexico and Arizona, and 1957 in Utah. Hotels and restaurants often refused to serve them. They were heroes forced into silence. Chester Nez, the last of the original 29 who passed away in 2014, wrote, "We were warriors who helped win the war, but couldn't tell anyone. The burden was heavy. Many sought healing through traditional Navajo ceremonies. The enemy way ceremony cleansed warriors from the spiritual weight of combat." Danaki explained, "We used our language to direct death. We needed it for healing. The ceremonies reminded us our language was sacred." The secret finally lifted in 1968, when the program was declassified. The first public recognition came a year later, in 1969 at a 4th Marine Division reunion. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. The most important honor came on July 26, 2001, when President George W. Bush awarded Congressional Gold Medals to the original 29 Code Talkers in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. Only 5 of the originals were still alive to attend. President Bush said, "Today we honor 29 Native Americans who gave their country a service only they could give." Chester Nez replied, "We were ordinary men given an extraordinary task. We used our sacred language to help win the war." While the Navajos became the most famous, they were not alone. 14 other tribes also served as Code Talkers. The Choctaw had pioneered the idea in World War I. In World War II, 17 Comanche Code Talkers landed in Europe on D-Day. The Hopi, Cherokee, Lakota, and others all contributed their languages to the fight. In 2008, the Code Talkers Recognition Act finally acknowledged every tribe's role. As John Brown Jr. said, "They told us our language was no good. Then they needed it to win the war." The Navajo Code proved the sophistication of Native American languages. The Code Talkers modernized their mother tongue on the battlefield, adapting metaphors, inventing terms, and creating new constructions to meet the demands of modern war. The agglutinative structure of the Navajo language allowed entire complex ideas to be expressed in just a single word. What might take full paragraphs in English could be communicated in only a few short Navajo phrases. Dr. William Morgan explained that the Code Talkers proved indigenous languages were not primitive. They showed Navajo could handle everything, whether it was sacred ceremonies or modern warfare. The Navajo Code also created a form of cultural encryption. Its security came not from math, but from the barriers of language and tradition. No formula could solve it. This lesson shaped post-war intelligence strategies, and even today, as quantum computing threatens mathematical codes, the Navajo achievement remains relevant. Colonel David Hatch summed it up clearly. The Code Talkers achieved something unique in history, a code that was never broken and never compromised. They proved that human language could surpass mechanical encryption. By the 1980s, Japanese scholars began examining why they had failed. Professor Tetsuo Yoshikawa revealed that 30 cryptanalysts had been assigned exclusively to the Navajo transmissions for 2 years, working with multiple universities. Captain Minoru Yamada admitted, "By late 1943, we realized it was a Native American language, but we couldn't determine which one." Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Fukumoto later said, "Using a native language was so simple, so elegant, we never even considered it." In the 1990s, photographer Kenji Kawano began documenting the surviving Code Talkers. His exhibits in Tokyo and Hiroshima introduced Japanese audiences to the story for the first time. During these events, Code Talker Albert Smith told Japanese listeners, "We were both warriors. My language helped defeat you, but now it helps us understand one another." By 2010, the Japanese Association of Intelligence Studies hosted a symposium where Admiral Hiroaki Abe declared, "The Navajo Code represents perfect encryption. We had Asia's best cryptographers, yet we were completely defeated." The legacy became even more personal with time. Chester Nez, the last of the original 29 Code Talkers, passed away on June 4, 2014. Today, only 2 Code Talkers survive from the roughly 400 men who served. Though not among the original 29, Thomas H. Begay and Peter MacDonald played crucial roles in keeping the code alive during the war. Even at age 96, MacDonald continued speaking publicly, reminding America, "We showed that our nation's strength comes from diversity. Our different languages and cultures make us stronger." The Navajo language, once suppressed in boarding schools, is now valued as strategically important. Federal programs now use the Code Talkers story to promote native language revitalization. Across reservations, young Navajo people study their ancestral tongue with a renewed sense of pride. Dr. Jennifer Dennett-Dale observed, "The Code Talkers changed how Native Americans see themselves and how America sees Native Americans. They proved our languages aren't relics but living resources." Between 375 and 420, Navajo Marines served as Code Talkers, sending tens of thousands of flawless combat messages under fire. Their true significance lies in what they represented. The U.S. government had once tried to silence native languages, but those very languages became weapons that defended the nation. Young men from communities denied basic rights gave America a tactical advantage its allies could not match. Japanese failure was not only a military defeat but also a failure of imagination. They prepared for American technology and codes but not for America's diversity. Their empire, built on ideas of racial superiority, was partly undone by the very diversity it dismissed. Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, Japan's top intelligence officer, finally admitted that his country never broke the Marine Code. His words reflected more than a tactical loss. They revealed Japan's inability to confront an enemy whose strength came from places they could not understand. The Code Talkers embodied a version of America that Japan's ideology simply couldn't recognize. They showed that America's greatest power wasn't just factories or weapons, but its human diversity. The Navajo language that boarding schools once tried to erase became a decisive tool in victory. Today, as the last Code Talkers pass into history, their legacy endures. What was once forbidden is now taught with pride. Native American veterans are honored for serving at the highest per capita rate of any group. The belief that diversity strengthens national security is now widely accepted. When Navajo voices carried across Pacific battlefields, they carried more than coded orders. They carried a message that still matters. America's strength comes from many voices, united in purpose yet distinct in identity. The unbroken code is proof that differences are not weaknesses, but strengths to celebrate, protect, and use for the common good. Even Japanese intelligence officers who failed to crack the code recognized its deeper meaning. They understood that some codes remain unbreakable not because of math, but because of the infinite complexity of human cultures. The Code Talkers transmitted countless messages the Japanese never understood. But their greatest message was not military, it was universal. Diversity creates strength. Culture creates power. Indigenous knowledge can serve modern purposes. Young Navajo Marines once used their sacred language as a weapon of war, and later as a tool of peace. They proved that America's strongest encryption was its diversity itself, unbreakable because it rises from the limitless experience and wisdom of human life. And even now, the unbroken code still lives on, in every Navajo child learning their language with pride, in every recognition that minority contributions make America stronger, and in every acknowledgement that differences, far from dividing us, are what hold us together. The Code Talkers left behind an eternal truth. Many peoples, many voices, and many languages, united yet diverse, create the unbreakable code of freedom itself.